Yeah, I am what would be called a true citizen soldier. I got out of Penn State 1967 and got immediately trying to get in the Air Force faster than the Army got me into the Army, basically. And I would take an Air Force physical, Army physical. That went on, and there was a sort of a dead heat on the merry-go-round in November of '67, where Uncle Sam said, we want you to come to Fort Dix with a toothbrush on the 20th of November. And I'd already been accepted for OTS and pilot training in the Air Force, and the draft board didn't care. So I went back to the recruiter and says, I can fix you up, we'll enlist you. So I spent 6 weeks enlisted before I went to OTS, basically. So I got to see the other side of the coin, and my affinity for the enlisted guys was always a lot better than most officers because I'd been on the other side a little bit, basically. It was not my intent necessarily to serve my country, but I was sort of old school, and you did what your duty was, you were called to do at that time. And I guess a little background, I was born in Philly, grew up in South Jersey, graduated from Haddon Heights in 1963, Penn State 67, and the Air Force in 87. When I got back from Vietnam, there was pretty much a recession, and every time I came to a point where I could get out, it always seemed more expedient to stay in, so I ended up in for 20 years. I retired as a pilot from the Air Force in '87, and was fortunate enough that the age discrimination rules had come into effect for the airlines, so I was able to get a job with Pan Am for 4 years until they went bankrupt, and spent a year on the street, so I know what it was like not to have a job for about a year, and wonder, the sanitation guys have a job, I don't. And most guys identify with what they do as who they are. I never really did that, but after 6 months of that, you begin to wonder about yourself. And so it's tough. So I can relate to that. I was fortunate enough that when Pan Am went out of business, they signed an agreement with United that they would interview the Pan Am guys that didn't get hired on the Delta. And I was fortunate enough to have an interview that I got to fly for United for 12 more years. I retired in 2004 on a medical, and so I've been under my wife's feet for about 8 years now at this point in time. One thing with the all-volunteer Army is that I think the civilian population loses contact with what the military is really about. In the old days, an awful lot of the guys were in, so everybody knew what the military was. For me, the simplest thing is they're the watchdog that you have there to keep the bad guys from coming in the fence, basically. And we're going through a guns and butter thing right now where they're probably going to cut the military back drastically. And the metaphor I always used, after a while we forget why we had the watchdog, because there are burglars around because the watchdog's there. So as a result of that, we stop feeding the dog gets sick. When the dog gets sick, the burglars come up and say, oh, that's why we had the watchdog. So we'll probably go through that cycle again. I was a Vietnam guy. The difference with that war, they didn't call it a war at the time, it was a police action because of the political game that was being played, how we could be doing it in the first place, because not necessarily everybody was in agreement with it. And I guess one of the things we lose with an all-volunteer Army is that there are an awful lot of people that can look at war just like it's another TV show. Whereas if your kids are over there fighting, it's a whole other matter. And the anti-war movement, unfortunately, it did some good in terms of getting us out of there. The downside of that was the soldiers sort of was shoot the messenger thing. When we came back from Vietnam, it wasn't pretty. Fortunately, we learned that subsequently, and we honor the guys that did their duty, and and we take it out on the politicians. In the old days, it was pretty much shooting the messenger, basically. And it's nice to see that they have jobs for vets and the wounded warrior and those kinds of things. I think we're back on the right track from that standpoint. Stanley likes to have me show the colors. What I generally do is memorialize a friend that I lost in Vietnam. I jumped out of an airplane. There were 11 of us on board. There was a mechanical failure in a propeller airplane, basically. We had to bail out, and bailed out over the China Sea by Da Nang. And there were 11 of us that went out, and one of us didn't come home, basically. In 1982, I was in the squadron, and I was a staff officer, a pilot, and what I used to call Mr. Only One Available, about 9 different crew categories, from instructor, pilots, flight examiner, special operations, low level, air refueling, all the things you did in the airplane. So you didn't go by the scheduler's desk, because if you were there, I had something for you to do. Well, one day I was walking through the scheduler's office, and somebody says, "Anybody served in Vietnam?" And I said, "Why?" "Well, they want somebody to speak 4th of July VA-sponsored POW." And having lost Clyde, generally, if you learn to keep a low profile, I felt obligated to go ahead and do it at that point in time. Generally, don't care for public speaking much, but in that environment, I felt like I owed it to him anyway. And as a result of that, instead of doing the speech, I wrote a poem, because as somebody once said, I've been blessed to live the Apollothian life of a pilot and the Dionysian life of a poet. I'm a writer. I've spent most of my last 8 years or so doing a blog. I wrote a book in 2006. The book was finished, and it was sort of after the bailout. How should we say, used up all my 9 lives in one night, basically, and sort of the next day wondered, well, why am I here and what's it all about? Because I really shouldn't be here anymore. Maybe I should get with the program. I went searching for truth through all the religions, and being of an intellectual bent, it was a cross-correlative study. In 1978, I sort of had an epiphany reading the Bible, and I said, my goodness, they're all talking about the same thing. But with an epiphany, it's like you get to see the whole thing, then you come back here and you can't put it into words, basically. And I've been trying to put it into words for about 40 years now. And the book was what I would call my 40-year state of the head message. Within the book itself, there are 3 or 4 summations of what I understood the truth to be at the various points and so forth. Most recently, I've done a blog for 6 years and probably 1,000 posts and so forth. And they're all what I would call variations on it's like this, it's like this, it's like this, it's like this, and if I can evoke it, and it's like you can say aha, or you get a direct transmission of the information. Whereas normally there's a loss of fidelity in terms of what I understand, how I say it, what you understand, what I say to mean, and so forth. So it's sort of to evoke a sense of truth in it. That's a little digression, but let me read the poem that was written to my friend and comrade Clyde. Let's see. I tried to do this on Stanley's radio show without, and this was like, but I should be able to find it go around here. There we go. In fact, I'm going to share this with you because this gets really personal. Basically, during the bailout, we had taken off of Da Nang. Da Nang is right by the China Sea. You probably heard the term China Beach. There was a TV show. Well, that was a French resort area right in Da Nang, basically. You took off of Da Nang over the water to a reverse teardrop, got you high enough so
if you took off this way, they'd be shooting at you as you were taking off. So you get high enough above the anti-aircraft fire. Generally at that, around Penang, it would have been rifles and those kinds of things. You get high enough and then you go west over. We worked the trails, basically. Ho Chi Minh Trail, where they would bring all the supplies down through Laos, Cambodia, and then bring them into Vietnam. In the military, they call it, it's interdicting the logistics. In this case, it was the truckers and so forth. And we shot at them, and they shot at us and so forth. But we lost the prop, came around, and then went back the other way and bailed out 11 guys. I ended up in the water for, probably about a half hour to an hour. The reason for the metaphysical stuff is I had 4 experiences, you would call them altered states of consciousness. Time stood still. There was a me watching me, in-body, out-of-body kind of thing where there are 2 me's. The psychiatrists would call that dissociative phenomena. I would argue that our normal state of mind is the dissociated one, because in this particular case, it's like you step back, longer focal length, bigger breadth of vision, total life recall, got into the water, everything was standing still. It wasn't slow motion, it was stopped, basically. And it's almost like your entire life is there, and you'll say, well, to survive, I need this. All that information is immediately available. You get into the water now, there's no immediate threat. You come back to our normal frame of reference, and I went into shock. I'd had a pretty bad attitude towards that point in my life. Life wasn't that big a deal. Dying wouldn't be a big problem anyway. And at that point, I got a little voice that said, okay, you said you never cared if you live or die, choose. And in that moment, you'll choose life, and the shock, which is a physical thing, went away, which is obviously pretty miraculous if you think about it a little bit. But that's the night. As I said, I was in the water for about a half hour. I got picked up by a helicopter. I quit smoking a month before. PJ offers me a cigarette and says, how about a cigarette? Little voice says, you turn this one down, you got to live for life, because you're never going to want one more than that. And I didn't take it. I subsequently smoked a little bit, but I quit it, about 35 years ago, I guess. I quit the beer about 15 years ago and so forth. Again, I digress. But let's see if I can